Sentiment on the Wall Street is obscured due to the signs of easing inflationary pressure and the cooling labor market. Still, it's not enough for a clear-cut sentiment, as investors are confused because dovish comments from Fed's policymakers confront hawkish policy moves of the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Bank of Canada taken this week. All in all, the outlook for the Fed's decision is overshadowed. The benchmark stock index is closed mixed amid uncertain market sentiment. The Dow Jones was the only index to close higher. It gained 91 points or 0.27%. The Nasdaq printed the heaviest loss and closed 1.29% down. The S&P shed 0.38% to close at 4,267 points. The major stock indexes traded also mixed in the New York pre-market. The indexes were making minor fluctuations, and the S&P 500 is expected to trade in the narrow intraday corridor between 4,240 and 4,310 points. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq closed in the red yesterday because investors fixed profits after a multi-month rally in high-tech stocks. Investors decided to sell shares of high-tech giants and shifted focus to companies with a small market capitalization. As a result, the Russell 2000 index rose by 1.78%. The Dow Jones Transportation Index hit a 6-week high, while the KBW Regional Banking Index closed at a more than a 2-month high. The energy sector in the S&P climbed by 2.65% on a recovery in the oil prices, leading the rise. Stocks were affected by rising yields in the U.S. Treasuries after the Bank of Canada increased interest rates, and this move cemented investors' fears about the next policy move of the Federal Reserve. As for individual companies, Wells Fargo raised its price target for Netflix stock to $500 from $400. The streaming company's shares inched up by 0.12% on the news. Coinbase shares rose by 3.20% today after hitting a 7-month low, as the company's CEO reassured clients of the safety of their funds and accused the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission of bias. As earlier on Thursday, the key indexes reversed but maintained a weak momentum. At the same time, after a rate hike by the Bank of Canada and the reassessment of the likelihood for the Fed's rate hike, the Wall Street Wix index rebounded after falling to a pre-pandemic low. The data on initial jobless claims for the last week showed signs of a cooling in the labor market, but the stock indexes gave a muted response to the latest statistics. The number of Americans who filed first-time claims for unemployment benefits increased sharply to 261,000 last week from 233,000 a week ago, the highest score since October 2021. The actual reading is much higher than the expected 235,000 growth. The indicator has been rising for 3 weeks in a row. It might prove that the labor market is cooling down. Nevertheless, the stock indexes remain under selling pressure following a rapid rally during which the S&P 500 surged by almost 20% from its October low. Analysts suggest opposite outlooks for the S&P 500. Some of them predict that the index could slump to October levels because high borrowings cost could take the toll on the domestic economy. The wake-up call is that the S&P 500's rally this year has been triggered by just a few mega stocks like Microsoft and Nvidia, fueled in part by the AI hype, while much of the market has been in a decline. Other analysts point out that inflation has clearly subsided and the labor market is no longer overheated. Investors were also encouraged by the signals that the Fed could leave interest rates unchanged at its policy meeting in June and could raise them just once more this year. In this context, banks and analytical companies have upgraded their forecast for the S&P 500 at the end of the year to 4,300 and 4,550. In any case, before the release of inflation data in the Fed meeting next week, the indexes will move without a definite course, reacting to corporate news and a profit taking. On a case-by-case basis, Meta's shares fell by 0.7% today after EU industry chief Thierry Breton demanded the social media giant to take immediate action to crack down on an online child sex contact, as its voluntary child protection code doesn't seem to work. GameStop shares stumbled by 18.4% after billionaire investor Ryan Cohen took over as executive chairman after firing the previous CEO and posted a bigger than expected quarterly loss. The US dollar lost ground in midday. Its index slipped by 0.4% intraday to 103.60. The instrument is expected to trade in the corridor between 103.20 and 103.90. The US dollar index sank from the highest level in 3 months after a sudden rate hike by the Bank of Canada, and the index instantly lost almost 0.5% across major currencies. The Canadian regulator caught investors off guard, having increased the overnight target rate 4.75%, the highest level in 22 years. And this followed a rate hike by the Reserve Bank of Australia on Tuesday. And these decisions enabled the market to reassess the Fed's agenda, but bets remained almost the same. The market seems to be confident about a pause at the next Fed's meeting and a rate hike by 25 basis points in July. With such forecasts, the US dollar is losing its luster on the back of a more hawkish other central banks. The ECB is due to unveil its policy update next Thursday, and it's widely expected to raise interest rates by another 25 basis points. It will be followed by one more rate hike. As a result, interest rates will peak at 3.75%. The potential difference is in a monetary policies pushed the US dollar down. It's likely to remain under selling pressure until the release of inflation data. Besides, the US dollar lost its advantage as a safe haven asset. The Canadian dollar is enjoying its advance against the US dollar, and the USD card pair skidded by 0.11% to trade at about 1.3350. It's likely to hold in the intraday corridor between 1.3320 and 1.3370. The loonie strengthened to a 4-week high against the greenback yesterday because investors priced in another rate by the Bank of Canada next month. The regulator made this decision citing a surge in inflation in April and the fact that the core CPI remains at elevated levels for 3 months, and thus the central bank raised the key interest rate by 25 basis points to 4.75%, the highest level in 22 years, due to mounting fears that inflation could get stuck at highs amid steady economic growth. The Governing Council determined that monetary policy has not been sufficiently restrictive to balance supply and demand and bring inflation back sustainably to the 2% target. The rhetoric was hawkish, which is not surprising given the recent flood of data. If the data remains stable in the next few weeks, another 25 basis point rate hike will follow in July. Markets see roughly 60% chance of such a move next month. The Canadian dollar was also supported by data showing that Canada's exports jumped by 2.5% in April and hit a historic high in terms of volume. Today, the loonie's advance is supported by the recovery of oil prices. Brent crude futures rose by 0.3%. to $77.24 a barrel. US crude WTI futures added also 0.3% to trade at $72.70. As for the crypto market, it's trading quietly with a cautious optimism today. Bitcoin found support at 26,200 and rebounded by 0.2% in midday to 26,400, and popular altcoins are traded mixed. Meanwhile, the crackdown on the crypto industry is going on. Red hot news has come from the EU. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter and Google have to deal with a complaint to the European Commission and Consumer Protection authorities that online platforms are allegedly facilitating the misleading promotion of crypto assets. The fuss around leading exchanges Binance and Coinbase does not calm down. On Wednesday, Coinbase chief executive Brian Armstrong said that the company had approached the regulator for registration, but at their first meeting, Gensler received the exchange with a cold welcome. The SEC chairman is a truly exceptional, Armstrong said. Besides, it has become known from the lawsuit against Binance that merit peak on an offshore company controlled by Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao received about $11 billion in client assets through a Seychelles-based firm set up to accept client deposits. And the Commission alleges that Binance and Zhao used Merit Peak and Sigma Chain to pool corporate funds with their client assets and use the money as they see fit. This put clients' assets at a risk while Binance sought to maximize its profits, the Commission wrote in its civil lawsuit. With such fundamentals, it's quite difficult for cryptocurrencies to grow, but Bitcoin is staying afloat. The token found support at the level of $26,200. If the price falls below this point, it will go to the level of $25,700. An alternative scenario looks like a recovery in the levels of $26,700 and $27,000. Subscribe to InstaForex TV channel and stay up to date with us, and see you online tomorrow.